Hey everyone, welcome to History Today, a podcast-style discussion of the way history makes its way into our daily lives. Today we'll be drawing parallels between two different kingdoms and the way they defended themselves. The first is going to be the Kingdom of Gondor in its defense against Mordor, Balkoth, Harad, etc. And we're going to be drawing parallels to their defense and the defense of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms against the Viking raiders. So both of them actually are going to be using this system of beacons, which we see in the third Lord of the Rings film, and we'll be showing that both in this discussion and then broadening the context into defensive strategies of both. So this is very exciting. I have two guests to represent kind of the expertise in both sides of things. The first one is going to be David Stone, and I'll let him take it away.
Hiya, I'm Dave Stone. I graduated last year from the University of Exeter. I finished my PhD in Archaeology and Medieval History, and I spent 4 years exploring the English response to the Viking Age and the physical legacy of the unification of England in the West Midlands.
And also joining us is going to be Edward Gill, and I'll let him introduce himself.
Yes, thank you. Hello. Most people know me as Archaeology on YouTube, of course, where I have a series of videos relating to the lore of Lord of the Rings and the wider legendarium in itself. And I also run a little mod that converts Medieval 2 Total War into Lord of the Rings. So a very Lord of the Rings based background.
Yeah, and it's going to be awesome to see how these two meld together. So like I said in the opening, we're going to be discussing the beacons of Gondor. So we're going to start off kind of with this famous scene in the Lord of the Rings film where all of a sudden Gondor has to call for aid. You have the first beacon that is lit, and then all of a sudden, down the mountain range, more and more beacons are lit. You have this long, awesome panning shot of the mountain range with the message being carried all the way to Rohan, and you have the awesome uplifting music, and it's very epic. So we wanted to take the chance here to talk about kind of what's the historical background, both in real life and in the lore. So I'm going to let Edward talk a bit about kind of what is this beacon network that we're seeing in The Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, so the beacons at their core, Gondor is obviously a very large nation, and it is frequently attacked, but predominantly on its eastern edge. And so in an attempt to get the peoples from the various fiefs and lands that Gondor controls, in order to A, warn them that they might be attacked, and B, try and get their able-bodied men over to Minas Tirith and the eastern edge of the nation, they have the beacon system that runs along the north and southern sides of the White Mountains, which is a large mountain range that splits their nation in half. And in the film, certainly, we very famously see the camera pan along the northern edge of the mountains, following the beacons right through, as you say, to Rohan. You don't tend to really see them on the southern side, unfortunately, in the films, as they omit that area altogether. In truth, if we were to discuss perhaps the book for just one brief moment, the beacons don't actually send word to Rohan. A messenger with what's called the Red Arrow sends word to Rohan, but he uses each beacon because they aren't just beacons, they're also way stations, and there would be fresh horses and provisions available, and each rider would obviously change horse as he gets to each stage, and it passes all the way along to the edge of Rohan, and in the south it passes down to the great city of Dol Amroth. Where perhaps the finest warriors of Gondor are housed in the nation of Dol Amroth.
Cool. And we'll be going over, maybe in the future of this podcast, a little bit of discussion of historical Anglo-Saxon defenses and Gondorian defenses. We'll save that for later. But for now, we're going to make the connection between this beacon network in Gondor and the one historically. So I think, David, you had a bit of points to make about that connection itself with Tolkien's knowledge of that system.
Yeah, Tolkien is famously a great medieval scholar. He's a professor of medieval literature, and in particular, he would have been very, very familiar with Viking sagas. And one of these provides the real basis, or one of the real basis of knowledge for interpreting the English system. And it's the saga of Hakon the Good, who is king of Norway in the 10th century. And he would have been fostered, according to the saga, in England. He would have, in the period, he was fostered in the court of King Athelstan as a child, and in the saga he's called Adelstein Fostre, meaning he was fostered by Athelstan. And according to Snorri Sturluson's saga, when Hakon returns to Norway, having grown up in England, he institutes a series of reforms. And it's important that he's fostered by Athelstan, because Athelstan in this period he's the first king of England. He declares himself the first king of all Britain, and he's a great reforming expansionist king. He inherits these systems of a militarized English kingdom from his grandfather, Alfred the Great, and then his father Edward and his auntie Athelflaed, and he grows up in her court, and he sees an inland beacon system being prepared in Mercia along the Viking frontier. And then Hakon, growing up in Athelstan's court, would have seen the same system in evidence, again in England. And when he returns to Norway, he institutes a series of military and legal reforms. And one of them is an order that beacons should be erected on the hills so that every man could see from one to the other. And it is told a war signal could thus be given in 7 days from the most southerly beacon to the most northerly thing seat in Halagaland. That's basically the length of Norway. So it's important that there's this idea that in 7 days the whole kingdom can be alerted to a threat, and men from everywhere can be directed to meet it. So even if Tolkien wasn't familiar with the English system, because it's alluded to vaguely in English texts of the period, it's not pinned down in any one setting, Tolkien would have definitely been familiar with this as an idea and a concept that he could have loosely associated with England, but definitely it's a system that he would have, and you can see it in Lord of the Rings as well, this idea that it goes across the mountains and it can alert the whole kingdom. It's an idea that Tolkien would have been intensely familiar with from his own studies.
And you had mentioned, I think, the same 7 days to notify the Norwegians would also be 7 days to muster the fiefs of Rohan.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or maybe not the fiefs, but the different war leaders.
The mustering. There's, if you're familiar with, I can't remember if it's an extended cut of the movie, but when the Rohirrim are mustering at Dunharrow, and they say, "Oh, so many have come, so few have come," but we gave them 7 days to come before we ride.
Potential parallel there. Okay, so Tolkien would have been familiar with this in existence. So now I guess we can transition into what is supposed to have existed. We can talk a bit about what is actually this network historically and how did it play into kind of the larger defensive network. So specifically about the beacons themselves, we mentioned in Lord of the Rings, perhaps in the books they were more way stations, etc., where messengers could go throughout and pass on messages. Same is perhaps true in reality. Were these also way stations where travelers could go, or was it actually meant for like bonfires to send signals?
So the interesting thing about the Anglo-Saxon system is we can split it into two different sets of sites that are integrated within the same system. There are two main Anglo-Saxon toponyms that we use to identify beacon sites. And interestingly, there is an Old English word for a beacon. It's a herre beacon, which is an army beacon. But these words don't tend to appear in the toponyms, the place names of sites that are used. The two words that are used are tort, which means to watch or to look out for, to spot, and ward, which means to ward, to guard, where we get words such as warden today. So there are these two place names. So a tote site is just a watch point. Usually it's a reuse of an reuse of an Iron Age or a Roman site. Bowl barrows, Iron Age bowl barrow burial sites are particularly popular because Iron Age burial customs dictate that prominent people are put on hilltops where they can watch over in death the lands that they ruled in life. And these provide fantastic vantage points, usually over main river crossings, roads, that kind of thing. And of course there's an elevated site, so a lot of these get reused. The Anglo-Saxons cut the top off, put a giant bonfire on top of them, and those are just watch points. But the other section of the system is areas called ward systems. A prominent example, for example, in Chester is the settlement of Burwardsley. And here we find evidence usually of fortifications, enclosures around settlements, and it's part of the burgle system, but they're not themselves burhs. But these would have been local refuges for the local population to take refuge in a crisis, but also an area where messengers could change horses, where reinforcements could gather, where local men could muster themselves, and where word could be spread to undefended settlements.
Okay, interesting. So on both sides, we kind of have similar time frame for the spreading of messages, similar intents and means for distributing the messages, but then the response, maybe we can talk about that. So the whole idea behind kind of the Anglo-Saxon defense is the Vikings rely on mobility and maneuver, and this message system is supposed to be allowing them to catch up with that speed and have quick responses. So can you, David, maybe talk real briefly about how the beacons figured into the larger defensive network of the Anglo-Saxons, and then maybe we'll go back to Edward as well and talk about the greater Gondorian defensive system.
Yeah, absolutely. So the English defensive system is in the kind of the late 9th and early 10th century is called the Burgle system. And it functions, it's kind of a historical analog in the blockhouse system that's used by the British in the Boer War and Malaysia, the kind of the forward operating bases that the American military used in Vietnam. And it's kind of also similar in a way to Roman military strategy. And the idea is that if you're fighting a force that relies on mobility and maneuvering, you need to deny them that opportunity, because Viking strategy aims to isolate small garrisons. It moves around larger forces, it picks off undefended towns, it strikes monasteries, it strikes villages with tiny garrisons. And the idea is that the defender is constantly putting out fires, and manpower is put all over the place, and they're kept disorientated, so they're never able to bring a sizable force to bear against the Vikings. So you stop this by, you fortify your road junctions, you fortify your river crossings, you cut down the routes that they can travel along, and then you use those bases as operating points to operate. There was a great rethink a couple of years back. There was a project called Beyond the Burgle Hide Edge that was carried out in the UCL in London, and it rethought the way that the Burr system functioned, because the old idea was that these systems they're 20 miles apart, or sorry, they're 40 miles apart, and you're never more than 20 miles from a burr, particularly in Wessex. And the 20 miles is, roughly speaking, the distance that someone can travel in a day. So everyone thought, oh, well, it's fun, in the event that the Vikings turn up, you flee and you're never more than a day from safety. And then you thought, well, the Vikings aren't after you, they're after your cattle, they're after your goods, they're after anyone they can carry away. As a slave, they're after gold and silver and easily portable wealth. You can't drive a cow 20 miles in a day, you can't take your children 20 miles in a day. So the system was rethought, and a lot more effort was put into piecing together this wider defensive system. And similarly to how castles work in kind of the Norman period, they aren't designed necessarily to stop an enemy, they're designed to slow them down. So what we have is a wide network of local defensive hubs, villages with palisades around them, Iron Age hill forts that are repurposed and reoccupied. And the idea is that in an event of a crisis, if the Vikings turn up, for example, a raiding party begins, the local population lock the doors, bolt themselves in. Just to give context, the kind of defenses we're talking about are in the Lord of the Rings movie, somewhere like Bree. We're not talking significant defensive sites. We're talking just a big fence with a heavily barred gate. But that's enough to slow down raiders for a couple of hours while they try and get through the door. And the idea is that the moment you buy yourselves into these ward sites, you light the beacon, and then that travels from hilltop to hilltop to the nearest burh. And at that burh, they immediately know that there is a raiding party somewhere along that road. So the local garrison, the way the English defensive system is set up, there are always men on duty. And the idea is that garrison can immediately travel along that road or along that river. And whilst the raiders are still trying to get in, or whilst they're still in the area, they can catch them on the hop and they can force battle. Because hopefully while they're maneuvering from one direction, the garrison from another burh is moving to cut them off from behind or to block their exit. So the idea is that you delay the raiders, you prevent their mobility, and then you deploy a reaction force against them and limit their mobility, cut them down, and really, really box them in. So beacons are integral to getting the word out to your reaction forces, allowing them to respond, letting them know where the enemy is and what direction they're moving. But it's likely, obviously, that alongside this, there would have been horseback messengers, that kind of thing, or simply people running from one section to another. They're never more than about 10 miles apart. So the idea is that as an army goes, it can pick up smaller piecemeal garrisons as well, so that it has a good idea of what it's facing and where the enemy is.
Okay, yeah, because a fire signal can't tell you too much. It can tell you direction and maybe time, but it can't tell you how many men, what's the composition, any additional information. Okay. Yeah,
there's the Romans supposedly, and if you look on Trajan's column, the Romans have a very advanced system that could supposedly tell you how many men the enemy force had, its composition in terms of infantry, archers, that kind of thing, and their direction of travel. But they also have a bonfire system for the event that everything just goes horribly wrong and you just need to call for help. And the Anglo-Saxons actually reoccupy a lot of old Roman sites, but they don't have the infrastructure and the knowledge to maintain the advanced system, but they do know that in the event of a crisis, light a bonfire and someone will see it.
Got it. Okay, so maybe we can pivot over to the Lord of the Rings style of defensive networks. Edward, can you maybe give us a bit of a, what's the other side of the coin here for defenses? Or what's the threat and then what's the response and the defensive strategy?
Yeah, so throughout Gondor's pretty horrific history, if you will, they're very unique in Gondor in that there are two key factors that change the way that they play in regards, obviously, the more historical feature. And that is that Gondor's actual geography allows them to heavily fortify the river. So the entirety of Gondor, essentially bar Ithilien, is to the west of the Anduin River. And the Gondorians bring, of course, out of the depths of Numenor and the depths of time, they bring incredible seafaring skill. There are, other than the elves, who, of course, are no threat to Gondor, nobody matches Gondor on the waves, apart from possibly Umbar. So nations to the south, such as Harad, and nations to the east and north of Mordor, like the Balcoth tribes of Rhûn and the Easterlings themselves, the Wain Riders, Gondor's not too worried about them getting into the heartland through any sort of coastal raid or anything like that, and they're not too concerned about coastal raiding in general. So Gondor can throw all of its defensive might up to the Anduin River and just hold there, and that is exactly what they do. So the threat of Gondor, certainly in the Third Age, of course, is the raids from Mordor. And Gondor's strategy is entirely one of defences. Another key feature of the Gondorians, or indeed their Númenorian heritage, is that they are renowned masons. All of the grand structures in Middle-earth were built by the Númenorians, and the goal was very much to create these set locations where the enemy just would not get through. So whereas obviously, as David has said, in Anglo-Saxon, in that kind of time period, raids are a very common occurrence. Every town, village is a threat. Everything is a target. Whereas in terms of Gondor as a nation itself, the southern fiefs and indeed the western fiefs will very rarely ever know war. They will never see raids. They're never attacked by anything. The Gondorians are the superior nation throughout their history. So rather than worry about defending each individual town, they focus on where are the key points into our realm and let's defend them. So of course you've got the Black Gate, or the Morannon in Sindarin, that stops anything leaving Mordor. Of course they also build Minas Ithil, which later is captured and becomes Minas Morgul, but that gives them complete defense over the realm of Ithilien, and from this grand bastion, this great city, their armies issue forth. And then obviously when both of those fall to Sauron, then the Gondorians just pull back to the river, and they build the great fortress Isle of Caer Andros, which is a key crossing point into Gondor, or into Gondor proper. And rather than worry about any raids on the other side of the river, they just build a large fortress and they dare the enemy to come and get them off of it. And the same is obviously true of Osgiliath, which is for a long time their capital until it's eventually moved to Minas Tirith, when it was called Minas Anor and then changed to Minas Tirith at that time. But Osgiliath then becomes their key defensive location, and siege warfare is not something particularly prevalent in Middle-earth and indeed in the Legendarium. And whenever there is siege warfare, even right back to the First Age, it's often more just the enemy has ladders, they climb the wall, job done. There's very rarely long extended sieges with various siege weapons and this, that, or the other. So knowing that they can just hold the river against the inferior orc raiders, that's very much all they do. So the beacon system in Gondor is twofold, really. The point of it, on the northern side of the mountains, it is to warn the region of Calanarthon that there are enemies around and they might cross into your realm. Because for those of you familiar with the geography of Calanarthon, which later becomes Rohan, they can cross over the Anduin River north of the Falls of Rauros, and then they can completely pillage through Calanarthon. So it's very much the beacon system is kind of a warning to say you're on your own, best of luck, which is exactly what happens. Gondor essentially abandons Calanarthon to raiders until Rohan comes and they gift it to them. But in the southern side of the mountains, the beacon is very much a call to arms. Dol Amroth, Lamadon, Lossarnak, these are the most populous regions in Gondor, and this is where the bulk of their army lies. So the beacons on the southern side didn't need to convey any message other than we are being attacked and we need you. because in all of Gondor, if Gondor is being attacked, it is almost certainly at either Caer Andros or Osgiliath. And in both of those cases, the troops need to move northeast. So the message system didn't need to be intricate or extensive. It just needed to say, we need you. Can you start coming towards us? Which is exactly what it does at the Battle of the Pelennor Fields and the Siege of Minas Tirith. The beacon system is used just to bring the fiefdoms up, and all of the fiefdoms are present apart from various ones in the South Lamadon, particularly with Angbor, as we may discuss later. But certainly Dol Amroth, of course, Prince Imrahil very famously brings a large contingent of troops. Forlong the Fat comes from Lasarnak. He brings hordes of axemen from Lasarnak. They all come because of the beacon system to defend those key locations.
Interesting. So on both sides, you have kind of different defensive strategies. The one in Lord of the Rings is more concentrated defensive strategy, and then the one on the other side in real life in the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms is more a dispersed defensive system. And then within those two systems, the way you have to communicate is different. So in the dispersed system, it's much more recurrent use. You might even use it against certain bandits or small raiding parties. You have to develop more details of it because you have to know a bit more about what's going on, where they are, what their composition is. Whereas in Lord of the Rings, where it's much simpler messages because you're in concentrated areas, it's more predictable where the enemy is going to come. So that's kind of interesting. And then the next thing I guess we could talk about is pivoting a little bit over to the future use of the bonfires. So I think, David, you were saying that these bonfires that were first created, or the watching system that was set up during the Anglo-Saxon period, was later on used during the Elizabethan period as well.
Yeah, and it's one of these interesting things. Looking back, and it's kind of, as a slight aside, if I may, it's interesting to see the way that history forgets history. There's the great Anglo-Saxon historian is Frank Stenton. He writes in kind of the 1940s through to the 70s, and he famously says, there's no tradition. He says there's no tradition of beacon use in Anglo-Saxon England. But the Elizabethans themselves, when they are building the beacon system to defend against the Spanish Armada, there is a Elizabethan scholar called William Lambard, and he writes the fantastically titled Perambulation of Kent. And he calls it an assess of the particular watch and ward of our ancestors. And he travels the coast of Kent, and he later travels the entire south coast of England, where, of course, people are imminently worried about a Spanish landing. And he visits a series of beacon sites that he says were built and maintained by the Anglo-Saxons. So this is something that previously throughout history people have been aware of, and then just kind of gets overlooked later in the period. We know that a lot of them were updated. They'd actually been updated in the later medieval period, but in the reign of Edward III, he orders that the beacons around the English coast, which in his reign would have been used to defend against a potential French invasion, he orders that the wood piles that have existed since the ancient histories of our ancestors, as he calls them, be replaced by burning pitch buckets. And this is obviously the same system that the Elizabethans later use. But yeah, particularly on the Isle of Wight and in Kent, the Elizabethans use a vast kind of the relics of this Anglo-Saxon system that they use to warn themselves. And it gets used later again in the Georgian period, when again, during the Napoleonic Wars, England is again worried about the threat of a French invasion. At this time, it's semaphore towers, and a lot of them get built on the same spots because they're fantastic viewpoints. And it's during the Second World War, again, Britain's faced an invasion, and this time the Royal Observer Corps builds bunkers to watch for German parachutists and air raids. And they're slightly obsolete at this point. Obviously, there's the radar around the coast of England, but these Observer Corps positions are still there just in case the radar goes down. And a lot of them, especially in coastal regions, are built on the same sites. And of course, that obviously complicates the archaeology horrifically, because in many of these places you go and there is a concrete bunker from the 40s. And then, of course, you dig down beneath that and you find something, you find a Georgian concrete, and then below that, then you find your a bonfire doesn't leave that much, but there's usually a kind of a layer of carbonation and ash, basically. But it does complicate the archaeology in a lot of places, because these are sites that are used kind of up until 30, 40, some of them stay occupied right throughout the Cold War. there's a kind of a tertiary system of civil defense in Britain in the event that the Cold War turns hot, that these stations are still manned right up until the 70s and the 80s in some places. So as sites, they're almost in kind of continual defensive use throughout English history.
Yeah, that's super interesting, especially the British Isles being, well, islands. The main threat is for, warning against raiders, but naval threats, etc. I think before we were talking with Edward before about, maybe Gondor has good naval power, but they would have liked to have a warning system for the Navy when it comes to Umbar. So maybe we can touch on that before we end.
Yes, so whilst Gondor is far and away one of the most superior naval nations in Middle-earth, of course, the Umbarim, who share, for a very long time throughout the history of Middle-earth, they share common lineage with the Gondorians until they're eventually cleared out and replaced with Haradrim. But Umbar maintains a fleet for a very long time. I mean, Aragorn very famously attacks and sacks the port of Umbar in a raid that turns out to be overwhelmingly useful to the Gondorians. But the Umbarim recover, and indeed they do attack, and they often raid the southern shores of Gondor. But the Umbarim raids are not about stealing wealth or anything like that, such as the Vikings, as David was saying earlier. The Umbarim raids are kind of almost created out of pure hatred. Umbar just hate Gondor. They attack to kill as many people as they can, capture people possibly, we could suggest. Tolkien does talk of slaves, but never very extensively. And indeed, at the time of the War of the Ring, as we were saying, the beacons are lit and they're sent down to Dol Amroth, and many fiefdoms do reply, and they send troops to Minas Tirith, but very famously, Angbor of Lamadan, he doesn't return. And in Minas Tirith, they don't know why. This vast contingent of their forces, they don't know why they've not come to Minas Tirith, and that's because the Umbarim have attacked. And Angbor is the only one leading the defence at the mouths of the Anduin, the Athir Anduin. And so the beacon system works from Minas Tirith down, but there isn't a counter system to warn Minas Tirith that Umbar is coming. And it is the Umbarim fleet is eventually killed by Aragorn and the army of the dead. And then Angbor rides north with the troops he has. But there's no warning system for this. So they've got the beacons to warn them against Mordor, but nothing really warns them against Umbar. And they have to just rely on their superior navy if they can get it mustered and assembled. And then it's just very much down to individual lords of the fiefdoms to defend their own regions. And we're never really told very much in The Lord of the Rings how successful the Umbarim raids are. We merely know that they happen and they exist. But given the strength of the city of places like Dol Amroth and Pelargir, the two great naval ports, it wouldn't be too much of a stretch to suggest that Umbar raids are few and far between, and Gondor doesn't really consider them a major threat, which is why there's no counter system, I would suggest, back to Minas Tirith to say Umbar is coming, because they fear that they would trust that Dol Amroth and Prince Imrahil and his line and the lords of Pelargir would be able to hold Umbar back on their own, so there's no counter system.
Got it. Well, this has been awesome. Yeah, no, this is so great. I'm sure there's other historical parallels we'll be able to draw between The Lord of the Rings and obviously real history. Tolkien, as you said, being a medieval scholar. So I'm sure we'll find ways to return in the future. But for now, I think this is a good stopping point for the discussion of beacons in Gondor and defensive networks in both the Anglo-Saxon period and the Gondorian kingdom. So yeah, I will leave it there, and I'll let you guys say your goodbyes as well. Actually, if you can give plugs to wherever you want people to follow up with you, if you have any, that's more than welcome. So I'll start with David. Maybe you can say something about that.
I'm always active on Ask Historians on Reddit. If you have any concerns, at the moment I'm working on papers about the beacon system that we just talked about, actually. So I'm hoping to get some more work published in the next coming months. So keep an eye out in Anglo-Saxon studies in archaeology and history.
Great. Thanks. And then Edward?
Well, fortunately, I have the the accolade of being the only person on YouTube known as Galadirthan. So if you wish to follow up anything of my own, just simply search YouTube Galadirthan, and I can assure you it will bring you to me. And within there's various lore videos you can watch if you wish to learn a little bit more about Lord of the Rings. Or, of course, I would just implore you all to read The Lord of the Rings, because it's a cracking good book.
Thanks for that. All right. So like I said, we'll hopefully have more of these in the future. Thanks, everyone. And we'll see you in the next one. Bye.